This small lecture is going to add a little bit more to the story of the Great Depression. So in the last lecture about supply and demand for the monetary base in the Great Depression, we saw that the bank failures did increase the demand for cash and for reserves, which is shown by this shift in the demand for the monetary base from the red to the green, but that the supply of the monetary base went up by Fed action to keep the nominal interest rate at about 4%, and later on, the supply of the supply of the monetary base went up to bring the nominal interest rate down to zero. And we talked about the effects of that on the economy. But one thing I forgot to mention was the effects of inflation. So here's the graph of what happens to the nominal interest rate. We'll talk about this bump up around 1937 in a minute, but let's see what's happening to inflation. And you can see that inflation here is negative. Negative inflation is called deflation. And in fact, prices were falling at 11.6% rate during 1932. So that's a pretty low level of inflation. What does that do to the real interest rate? What it did was it meant that even though the nominal interest rate was, just a few percent, that the real interest rate, actually we can see what it was, in 1932, the nominal interest rate was coming down from about a little over 3% down closer to zero. But that decline is dwarfed by the effect of inflation, so that being negative, so that the real interest rate was 12.5%. So what's going on here? Do you really want to borrow money when that the money that you have to pay back is going to be worth a lot more in terms of what it can buy? Okay, so that's the story. So even though the nominal interest rate got to be quite low, the real interest rate was still reasonably high even in 1933. And then the deflation came to an end. You had, modest inflation here, and then the real interest rate became somewhat reasonable. And in fact, the economy was recovering pretty well. But you can see this increase in the real interest rate here. What was going on? Well, there was actually an increase in the nominal interest rate. Why did that happen? Well, the Fed made the mistake of saying, oh, there are all these reserves. Let's kind of mop up these excess reserves. So they increased the reserve requirements. Bad idea. It increased the demand for the monetary base enough to push the nominal interest rate up some. So it's a good thing that inflation wasn't lower, because that kept the real interest rate from being really, really high. But if they hadn't made that mistake, they could have had the nominal interest rate lower, and if assuming inflation stayed around the same, then the real interest rate would have been lower too. So you can see that the nominal interest rate bumped up. It wasn't a huge bump up, but it was, you've got 0.7% higher than you needed to be here. So that wasn't good for the economy. So that's the story I wanted to tell. Inflation matters. And if you can see the operation of supply and demand for the monetary base here, as the Fed increased the demand for the monetary base by increasing required reserves. Not a great idea, and it didn't work very well, but that's what they did. You could have hoped for a better recovery. There was a bit of a recession within the Great Depression right around here. Thanks for listening.